There are few words in the grim annals of the Imperium that strike deeper than traitor. For a chapter of the Adeptus as sworn to the Imperium with vows etched into gene seed and sealed with the blood of centuries, betrayal is not simply heresy, it is unmaking. When a chapter turns its back upon the Emperor, when the imperial Aquila is cast down and the purity seals are burned, it is not only a crime of faith, but a wound upon the very soul of humanity. For these warriors are not ordinary soldiers. They are demigods forged by the will of terror, defenders sanctified by sacrifice. And yet, in the crucible of the 41st millennium, even gods may falter, and even angels may fall. What follows is not merely rebellion, it is damnation, played out across the stars, written in ash, sealed in the blood of countless innocents. The fortress monastery stood as if it had always been there, carved into the bones of the mountain, its towers biting into storm clouds, its battlements crowned with statues of saints and heroes. To the serfs who lived in its shadow, it was eternal, immovable, as much a part of the planet as the seas and the sky. To the Astartes who called it home, it was more than stone and steel. It was sacred history. Every wall was engraved with victories, every chapel heavy with the echoes of oaths spoken by warriors long dead, every hall filled with incense and the drumming hymns of devotion to the Emperor. Yet marble, no matter how polished, carries veins of weakness. What looks invincible from a distance can be flawed within, and when the weight of centuries bears down, even the strongest structure may fracture. So too with the chapter that dwelt here. Its warriors marched in perfect formation, their armor glinting with the imperial Aquila, their bolters oiled and ready, their voices steady in prayer. But beneath the surface, hairline cracks had already begun to form, fractures invisible to the faithful eye, yet inevitable to those who understood that nothing, no stone, no oath, no genseed was beyond decay. The first fissures were born of neglect. Supplies from Terra had grown inconsistent, administratum quotas were delayed, requisitions arrived half-filled, and astropathic communiques brought no explanation. The fortress vaults that once overflowed with munitions and relics of war grew lean, and each shipment became an event of hope and disappointment in equal measure. The serfs whispered of shortages, and even among there were murmurs never spoken aloud in the open halls, but carried through the corridors of the Librarius, or between battle brothers in the solitude of their armor bays. Why had their pleas for resupply gone unanswered? Why were their campaigns fought with dwindling bolter shells and thinning promethium reserves, when they were sworn to defend the Imperium's world? It was not doubt in the Emperor himself, not yet. It was doubt in his servants, in the vast machinery of bureaucracy that fed and clothed and armed his angels. For what use were vows of eternal war if their weapons lay empty? The chaplains preached endurance. In sermons that shook the vaults of the Reclusium, they roared that suffering was sanctification, that the Emperor tested their resolve by starving them of material, forcing them to prove that faith, not steel, was their greatest weapon. And for a time, the warriors obeyed. They tightened their belts, sharpened their blades, and fought with whatever they could salvage. They tore weapons from the hands of fallen foes and sanctified them as their own. They blessed shells as relics before firing them, as if prayer might stretch their numbers further. Yet even as they fought with burning zeal, the seed of resentment was watered by every campaign where their blood spilled while imperial reinforcements never came. The administratum's tally scribes wrote them into records as if they were just another expendable regiment. The Inquisition's agents treated them as tools to be pointed at heresies and then discarded without thanks. Even the Astra Militarum commanders who relied upon them grew hesitant, whispering that this chapter's hunger for war was a drain upon already thin supplies. It was not abandonment in truth, not yet, but it felt like abandonment to those who had sworn to bleed for the Impericum. Then came the visions. Librarians, meditating within their sanctums, began to speak of dreams too vivid to dismiss. They described battlefields littered with bones that did not rot, stars that wept blood, shadows that whispered promises. At first the Reclusium dismissed them as echoes of the warp, the natural consequence of psychers who reached too deep in their contemplation. But the dreams grew sharper. Brothers began to hear voices, not only in sleep but in waking prayer. When they knelt before the statues of the Emperor, they swore they heard replies, murmurs promising strength, whispers urging them to take what was denied, to carve their own fate rather than wait for the Imperium's leaving. The chaplains grew harsher, silencing such talk, punishing those who dared to repeat what they had heard. But silence does not erase temptation. It buries it deeper, where it festers unseen. The apothecaries, too, noticed changes. Gene seed that had once been pure showed small anomalies. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would call for censure from the Mechanicus, but subtle shifts, organs functioning with heightened aggression, hormones surging with greater volatility, temperaments fraying into sudden violence. They recorded the changes dutifully on their data slates, presenting them to the chapter master as curiosities, aberrations that might be traced to battlefield toxins or environmental contamination. But in private, they whispered their fears. What if the anomalies were not accidental? What if they were the first signs of corruption, creeping into the chapter's sacred blood? What if their gene seed, the very gift of the Primarch, had begun to fracture under strain? The chapter master bore the weight of these doubts in silence. To the serfs and to the line brothers, he remained unshakable, his presence in the fortress monastery as immovable as the statues that loomed above. But in his private chambers, he paced. He read reports of dwindling supplies, of visions in the Librarius, of mutations noted in the Apothecarian. He weighed them against the constant demands of the Imperium, each new campaign order arriving like a hammer blow upon already strained warriors. He prayed before the great golden Aquila in his hall, prayed for guidance, for strength, for some sign that the Emperor still watched over them. But the only answers came in silence or in whispers he dared not name. That it was not one moment, not one betrayal or one heresy that broke the marble. It was the slow accumulation of fractures, a supply fleet that never arrived, leaving an entire company stranded with empty magazines, a planetary governor who denied them tribute, citing administratum edicts, while their warriors starved, a librarian who fell into convulsions during a battle and spoke in tongues that made even demons hesitate, a chaplain who, in the heat of a sermon, demanded that his brothers ask themselves whether loyalty was a two-sided bond, or only a leash held by those who cared nothing for them. These were the cracks, small, deniable, easily dismissed if one wished to remain blind. But the chapter no longer had the luxury of blindness. They could see the fractures spreading, and though they told themselves they would endure, some part of them already knew endurance was not enough. In the stillness of the fortress monastery's deepest vaults, relics lay cloaked in dust, their purity seals long since faded, their histories half forgotten. Among them were tomes not read in centuries, scrolls written in blood as much as ink, weapons whose design bore marks not entirely of the mech. Such relics were supposed to be warnings, preserved as records of temptation resisted, of paths not taken. But in times of desperation, warnings can look like answers. Brothers found themselves drawn to these vaults, not by command, but by hunger for knowledge, for strength, for anything that might fill the void left by the Imperium's neglect. And when they gazed upon these relics, when they read words not meant to be read again, when they touched blades that hummed with alien resonance, they felt something awaken in them. Not lies, but recognition. The whispers were not new, they had always been there, waiting. And so the cracks widened. Marble does not shatter in silence. It groans, it moans, it warns of its breaking. So too did the chapter. Arguments broke out between captains. Some argued for obedience still, for faith unbroken no matter the cost. Others demanded action, to claim what was denied, to carve their own destiny with bolter and blade. Chaplains thundered against heresy even as their own sermons grew tinged with bitterness. Librarians sought to master the voices in their heads even as those voices grew louder. Apothecaries clung to their rituals even as they concealed the gene seed's changes. The fortress monastery still stood, its towers still crowned with statues, its banners still heavy with oaths to the emperor, but the sound of cracking was everywhere, in every whispered word, every hidden scroll, every prayer that turned into plea. This was how it began, not with open rebellion, not with banners torn down or idols desecrated, but with cracks in the marble, subtle, deniable, yet growing. The chapter still called itself loyal, still swore oaths to terror, still painted the Aquila across their armor, but beneath the surface, they were already something else, already wounded, already shifting, already standing at the edge of a precipice they would soon tumble over. For in the grim darkness of the far future, betrayal is never sudden. It is slow, patient, inevitable, and when it comes not as surprise, but as the conclusion of cracks that were there all along. The transition from silence to doubt is never announced with banners or trumpets. It is gradual, like the slow creep of mold across a wall, spreading so subtly that one only notices it when the rot is already entrenched. In the fortress monastery life carried on as it always had. The serfs lit the braziers each dawn, their chants echoing through the vaulted halls. The Astartes marched in perfect cadence, their bolters slung across ceramite plate, their visors polished until they gleamed beneath the light of the sanctum lamps. The librarians still cloaked themselves in incense before their meditations. The chaplains still thundered from the pulpits of the and the apothecaries still bled the gene seed into vials as if nothing had changed. To the untrained eye, the chapter remained unbroken, but within the minds of its warriors, doubt had already taken root. Watered by hunger, tended by silence, fertilized by a sense of abandonment so heavy it bent the soul. It began with whispers passed between squads. During long voyages in the cold dark of voids, Marines strapped into their drop pods spoke of campaigns where they had been left to bleed for months without reinforcements, while administratum tallies claimed them resupplied and supported. Brothers around the mess tables murmured about shipments that had never arrived, of relic requests denied, of petitions sent into the void with no answer. Does the Imperium not know our sacrifice? They asked, or does it simply not care? At first these were only questions, posed with bitterness but still coated in loyalty. The Emperor was not blamed. How could he be? The Emperor was the beacon that guided all, but his servants, his mortal machinery of scribes and officers and governors, those could be doubted. Those could be cursed quietly, away from the ears of chaplains. On campaign, the seeds grew into vines. When orders came down from sector command, the captains would weigh them with a silence that spoke louder than any prayer. Missions once carried out with unquestioning obedience were now debated in council chambers. Were these orders worthy of the chapter's dwindling strength? Did the Imperium truly value their service, or were they being thrown like chaff into the void, spent recklessly while other chapters, closer to terror, received support and reverence? To refuse outright would have been heresy, but to debate, to stall, to interpret orders in ways that aligned more with the chapter's survival than the Imperium's demands, that was not yet rebellion. That was pragmatism born of necessity. And yet, in every compromise, the seeds of rebellion grew thicker roots. The librarians, tormented by visions, began to interpret them with a dangerous boldness. They claimed the dreams were not madness but prophecy, that the Emperor's silence was itself a message, urging them to act as his true hand in the galaxy, unshackled from the incompetence of his mortal servants. One librarian in particular, a warrior scholar named Vayner, spoke with the fervor of a prophet. His visions, he claimed, showed the chapter as a blazing star in the void, surrounded by enemies both alien and human, yet triumphant because they had cast aside the chains of bureaucracy. He whispered that the Emperor demanded faith not in parchment decrees but in strength, that loyalty meant action, not submission. His words spread, carried by those who admired his insight, repeated by those who found in them justification for their unease. Though the chaplains condemned such interpretations as dangerous, they too were weary, and their voices, once thundering like thunderbolts, now cracked with doubt. Among the gin seed anomalies became an open secret. Brothers found themselves growing quicker to rage, quicker to act, their impulses sharpened into blades. The apothecaries whispered of purity compromised, but when they reported to the chapter master, he gave no answer save silence. What choice did he have? To report such abnormalities to terror would invite scrutiny, suspicion, perhaps even censure or destruction of the chapter. And so he said nothing, burying the knowledge beneath layers of secrecy, convincing himself that to protect his sons was to protect the Imperium. But secrecy is the soil where doubt thrives. The warriors sensed that something was being hidden from them, and their imaginations twisted the unknown into horror. Some said the Emperor had turned his gaze away from them. Others said the gods of the warp had begun to notice them, and others still believed their own apothecaries were lying to them, concealing truths too dangerous to speak. Campaign after campaign deepened the cracks. On the world of Castora Prime, the chapter was dispatched to suppress a rebellion of hive gangs who had fallen under the sway of heretical preachers. The battle was brutal, fought across rusting manufactoria and decaying hub blocks, with ammunition rationed so tightly that Astartes fought hand-to-hand more often than they fired their bolt. When victory was finally achieved, the administratum agents who arrived to secure the world refused to release its forges to the chapter, citing bureaucratic edicts. The warriors, bloodied and scarred, were forced to march past the manufactoria they had bled to secure, denied even the right to claim the spoils of their own sacrifice. In silence, they loaded into their strike cruisers, their jaws tight, their prayers muted. To the serfs who served them, their silence was more terrifying than rage. Doubt was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a shadow in every hall, a presence in every prayer. When chaplains called upon their brothers to swear anew their oaths of loyalty, the responses came slower, less certain, as if the words caught in the throats of the faithful. When librarians spoke of their visions, brothers listened with a hunger they dared not admit aloud. When apothecaries passed along, Jinseed brothers accepted the vials with suspicion in their eyes, wondering if corruption already ran in their veins. The fortress monastery still gleamed in the its banner still heavy with oaths, but inside its walls, the marble groaned with strain. It was during the siege of Ethar's Reach that the seeds bore their first fruit. The chapter was ordered to defend an administratum archive world from orc invasion. The records stored there were said to be vital, containing centuries of taxation ledgers and population counts. To the imperial bureaucracy, this world was priceless. To the chapter it was worthless, a world of parchment and ink while their own fortress starved for supplies. When the order came, there was no cheer, no roar of devotion. There was silence. In the council chamber, the captains debated for hours, their voices echoing against marble walls. Some argued that loyalty demanded obedience, that the emperor's will was not to be questioned. Others spat that the emperor's will was being misinterpreted by petty scribes, that to waste their dwindling strength on parchment while their own homeworld bled was folly. The chapter master, torn between faith and survival, gave the order at last. They would deploy, but with only half their strength. The battle was a disaster. The orcs came in waves, endless, roaring, their crude engines shaking the ground. The half-strength force held valiantly, bolters roaring, chainswords screaming, but they were too few. The orcs overran the archives, burning towers of parchment, collapsing vaults of records into ash. The warriors withdrew in shame, their armor blackened with soot, their voices heavy with silence. The administratum's agents, furious at the loss, recorded the chapter's failure with venom. In the fortress monastery, the chaplains roared that the emperor was testing them, but the brothers no longer believed. In the dark of the reclusium, prayers turned into questions, and questions turned into whispers that perhaps the emperor's servants were not his voice at all, but parasites feeding on his name. When the whispers grew too loud to ignore, the first acts of defiance began. A small at first supply convoy seized from local governors, justified as tribute to sustain the chapter's holy war. Astropathic pleas for aid left unanswered, their choirs silenced by librarians who claimed the warp was too unstable for transmission. Imperial emissaries who arrived with new orders found themselves delayed for weeks, their words weighed and dissected until obedience was no longer immediate but conditional. These were not yet open rebellions. They were compromises, survivals, justifications wrapped in the language of necessity. But each act chipped away at the bedrock of loyalty, and the cracks in the marble yawned wider. It was inevitable that the warp would answer. In the silence of his sanctum, Librarian Vayner heard the whispers grow louder, clearer, promising that the chapter's suffering was not meaningless but chosen, that they had been set apart by powers greater than Terra's bureaucrats. He saw visions of the chapter no longer as servants but as masters, carving their own dominion in the stars, free of the Imperium's neglect. He spoke of these visions to his brothers, his words trembling with conviction, and they listened not with the obedience of soldiers, but with the hunger of men who had long been starved of hope. The chaplains thundered against him, but their sermons rang hollow. Their voices shook not with power but with fear, for deep down they too felt the emperor's silence, and in that silence, they feared abandonment. Thus the seeds of doubt bore their first poisoned fruit. The chapter was no longer unified in obedience, but divided in purpose. Each brother weighing loyalty against survival, faith against suspicion. The fortress monastery no longer groaned with hidden cracks, it trembled with the strain of choices unspoken, choices that would soon shatter oaths sworn upon Jinseed and Relic alike. The descent had begun, not with defiance, but with compromise, not with rebellion, but with questions. And questions once asked are not so easily silenced. There comes a moment when silence can no longer carry doubt, when compromise fractures into decision, when questions left to rot in the marrow finally burst into blood. For a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, bred for obedience, sworn by Jinseed and ritual to eternal loyalty, that moment is cataclysm. Every oath sworn upon relic and shrine, every litany of faith recited in battle, every scar cut into flesh in the Emperor's name, all of it shatters like glass beneath a hammer. And when it shatters, the sound does not echo in the fortress monastery alone. It resounds across the stars, carried by the warp, a scream of betrayal that the Imperium will never forgive, and the gods of the Eye of Terror will never forget. The breaking began quietly. It was not heralded by banners torn from the walls or statues smashed in fury. It began with the first refusal. A requisition order from a nearby forge world arrived, demanding the chapter's immediate deployment to repel a Necron incursion. The order was signed by administratum officials who had never bled, whose inked quills dripped arrogance as much as ink. The captains assembled in council, their armor echoing in the chamber, their eyes lit by the pale glow of lumen globes. For hours they debated, voices sharp, arguments tangled. Some demanded obedience still, that their vows were chains which could not be broken, that to deny was to court damnation. Others spat that they would no longer be treated as expendable tools, that their warriors were bleeding on a dozen fronts while the Imperium starved them of support. The chapter master sat in silence, his gauntleted hands clasped, his gaze heavy with the burden of centuries. At last, when silence fell, he spoke only 6 words: "We will not answer this call." Those words were the fracture line. The oaths sworn in the fortress monastery, etched into marble and sealed with blood, demanded obedience to the Imperium's summons. To deny was to betray, and yet the council chamber did not erupt in outrage. It fell into silence again, deeper, more terrible, as the weight of those 6 words settled into every heart. Some lowered their heads in grim acceptance. Others clenched their fists, torn between loyalty and survival. But none spoke to reverse the order. The decision had been made. The first oath had been broken. From that refusal came the spiral. Once a chapter learns it can deny, the next denial comes easier. An imperial governor on a nearby world begged for aid against orc raiders, promising tribute of grain and munitions in return. The chapter deployed, but when the governor's tithe fell short, they slaughtered his guards, burned his palace, and took what they needed. In the fortress monastery, the chaplains crafted litanies to justify the act, declaring that the governor had betrayed his sacred duty and that the chapter had merely enacted the emperor's will in punishing him. Yet even as the words echoed through the reclusium, the truth gnawed at every warrior who repeated them. They were no longer servants. They were executioners who answered only to themselves. The librarians spoke more boldly now, their visions clothed not in humility but in command. Librarian Vena, once whispered to be mad, now stood in the grand sanctum and declared that the emperor's silence was proof not of abandonment but of secret sanction, that the master of mankind had always intended his angels to act freely, unshackled by petty scribes and cowardly governors. His words filled the hall with fervor, his voice rising until even the chaplains dared not interrupt. When he finished, brothers roared in approval, their fists striking breastplates, their voices echoing like thunder. They no longer questioned, they believed. The warp's whispers had been recast as revelation, and in that revelation they found not shame but strength. It was during the campaign on Harrow's Fall that the oaths shattered completely. The chapter had been dispatched, reluctantly, to aid an Astra Militarum regiment holding against a Tyrannid splinter fleet. The guard fought valiantly, their trenches filled with blood and their officers barking orders through shattered vox grills, but they were breaking. The chapter's arrival was salvation, or should have been. For days the Astartes fought alongside the mortals, bolters roaring, chainswords carving through chitinous beasts, the ground soaked with ichor. But the supplies promised by the Munitorum never came. Ammunition dwindled, armor cracked, fuel ran dry. The guard begged for continued support, their officers kneeling before the Astartes, their men clutching lasguns with trembling hands. And in the council chamber, the captains spoke words that sealed their fate. "We will not bleed for them, not for men who cannot even feed us." When the order was given to withdraw, the guard screamed betrayal. Vox relays crackled with desperate pleas, commanders cursing the angels who abandoned them. The chapter ignored them. They boarded their strike cruisers, their thunderhawks lifting into the storm, their ships breaking orbit as the guard below were torn apart by Tyrannid claws. In the silence of the fortress monastery, the chaplains no longer thundered with litanies of loyalty. They spoke of survival, of purity preserved not through obedience but through strength. The emperor's statues still loomed above them, but their shadows seemed longer now, their faces harder to meet, and in the silence of their private prayers, more and more brothers whispered not to the emperor, but to the voices that promised power in return for defiance. The shattering of oaths was not limited to wars abroad. Within the fortress monastery itself, changes crept like rot. The sacred hymns were sung less often. The relics of the Primarch were polished less frequently. The purity seals upon banners grew brittle, their wax flaking, their parchment curling. Serfs whispered in terror as Astartes, who once treated them with stern but measured command, now barked with cruelty. Their tempers shortened, their eyes burning with something darker than zeal. Where once the fortress had echoed with discipline, it now pulsed with attention like storm clouds heavy with lightning. Ready to break. The breaking came when an inquisitor arrived, dispatched after whispers of the chapter's irregularities reached Terra. He arrived with his retinue of stormtroopers, his rosette gleaming with the authority of the Emperor's most feared servants. He demanded audience with the chapter master. He demanded records of campaigns, of GNC purity, of supply requisitions. He demanded answers for failures, for disappearances, for the whispers that trailed them like shadows. And in that moment, the chapter master faced his final choice. To obey was to risk censure, perhaps dissolution. To defy was to sever the last thread of loyalty. When the Inquisitor entered the council chamber, he did not leave. His retinue's screams echoed through the halls as bolters roared, as ceramite-clad giants tore through mortal flesh. When silence fell, only blood remained, staining the marble floors, pooling around the shattered rosette that had once borne the Emperor's authority. The chaplains tried to frame the slaughter as justice, claiming the Inquisitor had fallen to pride, that his accusations were treachery against the chapter's honor. But no sermon could erase the truth. The moment the Inquisitor's blood soaked the marble, the chapter had cast off its chains. The oaths sworn to terror, to the Imperium, to the Emperor's servants were gone. They were no longer bound. They were no longer loyal. They were traitors. From that day, the fortress monastery changed. The statues of the Emperor were not torn down, but fewer knelt before them. The litanies of loyalty were still spoken, but the voices were hollow, perfunctory, more ritual than belief. In their place rose new chants, new prayers whispered in dark corridors, prayers not to the Emperor but to the powers that had always waited in the warp. The librarians guided these prayers, their visions swelling with clarity, their whispers filling the halls like incense. The apothecaries, once guardians of purity, began to experiment, their laboratories filled with gene seed altered, twisted, strengthened. The captains spoke no longer of obedience but of survival, of conquest, of carving their own path in a galaxy that had abandoned them. The fortress monastery still gleamed in the stormlight. Its banners still bore the Aquila. Its warriors still marched in perfect cadence. But it was marble cracked beyond repair, its veins of weakness split open, its core hollowed. The chapter was no longer what it had been. The oaths that once bound them had been shattered, and in their place was something new, something dangerous, something damned. They had taken their first true step into betrayal, and there was no path back. The Imperium would mark them for death. The Inquisition would hunt them without mercy. Their brothers, among other chapters, would curse their names. But none of that mattered now. The decision had been made, the blood spilled, the oaths broken. They had crossed the threshold, and on the other side lay only war without end. The shattering of oaths is never silent. It echoes forever, written into the warp, carried into eternity. And the echo of this chapter's betrayal was only just beginning to resound. When oaths shatter, words lose their chains, but it is only through blood that true transformation begins. The chapter had crossed the threshold, yet for all their silence and defiance, they still clung to fragments of the old wise statues still standing in the fortress, hymns still echoing in hollow voices, banners still painted with the imperial Aquila. They told themselves they were free, that the Inquisitor's blood had sealed their independence, but in truth they lingered in the twilight between loyalty and damnation. It was not until their baptism in blood that the shadows closed fully around them, burning away the remnants of what they had been, leaving behind only the truth of what they had become. The first test came swiftly, as though the warp itself had been waiting. The murder of the Inquisitor could not remain hidden, no matter how thoroughly the chapter cleansed the council chamber of blood, or how tightly they sealed the mouths of serfs who had heard the screams. The Inquisition is a beast with many eyes, and when one eye closes, 10 more open. A fleet was dispatched, smaller than the hammer of terror but heavy enough to crush a single chapter if it struck swiftly. Ships bearing the sigil of the Ordo Hereticus slipped into the system, their augurs drinking in the fortress monasteries, every scar, their vox relays carrying demands for compliance. They ordered the chapter to disarm, to submit to questioning, to stand trial for their suspected crimes. It was a test of obedience, but also a trap, for if the chapter yielded, they would be broken apart, their gene seed seized, their warriors scattered, their name erased. If they refused, they would be marked in the annals of terror as heretics beyond redemption. There was no middle path. The chapter master called his captains to council. The chamber was heavy with silence, the air thick with incense and unspoken truths. No one spoke of loyalty anymore. No one prayed aloud for the Emperor's guidance. They all knew what had to be done, yet saying it aloud was still a leap across an abyss. Finally, Librarian Vayner broke the silence. His eyes burned with warp light as he declared that the Emperor's silence was proof of his will, that their survival was itself divine sanction, and that to resist the Inquisition was not betrayal but ascension. His words rolled across the chamber like thunder, filling the silence with conviction. One by one, the captains nodded, their fists tightening on bolter grips, their jaws set. The chapter master rose, his shadow long across the marble floor, and gave the order. They would not submit. They would not kneel. They would baptize themselves in the blood of those who came to erase them. The battle that followed was unlike any the chapter had fought before. No Xenos beasts charging with primal fury, no heretic mobs chanting blasphemies, no alien war machines grinding forward with soulless inevitability. These were humans, imperial servants, stormtroopers, inquisitorial agents, fleet commanders who had once sent them orders, brothers against brothers, servants of the same Imperium tearing each other apart. The fortress monastery became a fortress in truth, its battlements roaring with fire, its bastions spitting death. Thunderhawks screamed across the skies, dropping pods of ceramite giants into the midst of stormtrooper phalanxes. The inquisitorial fleet rained fire from orbit, but the chapter's strike cruisers rose to meet them, their lance batteries piercing the void with light like spears of the gods. On the battlements, bolters roared, Astartes cut through mortals like scythes through grass, their ceramite armor shrugging off last fire, their chain swords tearing through flesh and flak. Yet the stormtroopers did not break ice. They fought with the conviction of those who believe they are the Emperor's chosen, hurling grenades into the faces of giants, charging with bayonets against power armor. Their courage was terrible to behold, and for a heartbeat, the chapter hesitated. Was this what loyalty looked like? Was this the devotion they had abandoned? But hesitation was death, and death was not something they could afford. The Astartes slaughtered them without mercy, and when the bastions were slick with blood, the hesitation was gone. In orbit, the baptism grew darker. Strike cruisers rammed into inquisitorial frigates, boarding torpedoes slamming into hulls, spilling forth warriors who carved corridors of blood through the steel arteries of ships. The warp whispered in every chamber, librarians guiding their brothers with visions of victory that seemed to unfold before them as though the future itself bent to their blades. Apothecaries harvested gene seed from the fallen, not with reverence but with hunger, stockpiling it as fuel for a future where no more would come from terror. The chaplains roared not of loyalty but of wrath, their sermons twisted into cries of vengeance against those who dared to call them traitors. The climax came when the inquisitorial flagship, a grand cruiser whose prow bore a massive aquila of gold, descended into low orbit to break the fortress monastery with its bombardment. The chapter master himself led the counterstrike. He and his chosen leaped from orbit in boarding pods, crashing into the hull of the golden cruiser with the fury of meteors. They tore through its decks, killing officers at their posts, storming the sanctum where the Inquisitor Lord awaited with his retinue of warriors clad in carapace and faith. The duel was terrible. The Inquisitor wielded a daemon blade bound by seals of terror, its edge dripping with war. The chapter master met it with his relic blade, a weapon sanctified in the blood of 1,000 campaigns. Steel rang against steel, warp fire clashed with the light of ancient artificer craft, the clash of loyalty and defiance resounding across the void. When the battle ended, the Inquisitor lay broken, his daemon blade shattered, his body torn apart by a strike that cleaved him in two. The chapter master stood victorious, his armor drenched in blood, his blade dripping with warpike. Around him, his brothers roared in triumph, their voices drowning out the alarms and screams of the dying ship. They had not only resisted, they had triumphed. They had killed the servants of the Emperor and lived. They were no longer bound by oaths. They were baptized in blood, and in that baptism, they were reborn. From that day, the fortress monastery was never the same. The banner still bore the aquila, but it was a hollow symbol now, tolerated only as camouflage against the wrath of distant terror. The statues of the Emperor still stood, but brothers passed them without kneeling. Their eyes turned instead toward new icons, crude at first, painted in blood on the walls of the reclusium. The chaplains no longer preached faith in the Imperium but faith in strength, in survival, in the whispers that guided them from the warp. The librarians walked openly now as prophets, their visions no longer concealed but embraced, their voices filling the halls like hymns. The apothecaries experimented with gene seed, testing its mutations, bending it toward resilience and rage. Serfs spoke in hushed terror, for those who questioned too loudly disappeared into the vaults and were never seen again. The chapter master bore the weight of their baptism in silence. He knew the Imperium would never forgive them, that fleets would come, that other chapters would curse their name, but he also knew that they had crossed a line no power could erase. They had shed the blood of the Emperor's servants, and in doing so they had bound themselves to a new path, one carved not by terror's decrees but by their own blades. They were free now, in a way they had never been before. Free undamned. And so the baptism of blood was complete. The chapter that had once sworn eternal loyalty had drowned in the blood of those sent to judge them, and in that drowning, they had been reborn. They were traitors now, in truth and in deed, and the galaxy would come to know their name not as loyal sons of the Emperor, but as wolves turned loose, baptized not in devotion but in slaughter. After blood has been spilled, silence never returns the same. The halls of the fortress monastery no longer carried the hymns of loyalty, but they were not empty. Something else had come to fill them. At first it was only whispers, faint as the rustle of parchment, sliding through the cracks of stone vaults and echoing down corridors where the lumen globes flickered too often. The serfs heard it when they polished armor or carried censers of incense. They swore voices, muttered prayers in languages older than the Imperium, words that made the marrow of their bones ache. The Astartes heard it, too, though none wished to admit it aloud. When they knelt in their cells trying to recite the catechisms of hate, the words faltered as other syllables, strange and seductive, slipped unbidden from their tongues. In the quiet moments after battle drills, when their hearts still thundered and sweat clung to their necks, they felt a presence breathing just behind them, waiting to be acknowledged. That the librarians were the first to break the silence. Vayner, once regarded as a mad visionary, now walked the halls like a prophet, his eyes blazing with warp fire, his voice resonant with authority that had once belonged only to the chaplains. He declared openly that the voices were not the lies of demons, not corruption, but revelation. He spoke of the warp not as a storm to be feared but as a sea of truth, filled with gods who were not enemies but allies, waiting to share their strength. "We have been deaf too long," he said in the great sanctum, his words echoing beneath vaulted ceilings. "We were shackled by terror's silence, but now the dark itself speaks, and in its voice we find not chains, but freedom." The chapter listened. Some still clenched their fists, whispering litanies of resistance under their breath. Others nodded, their hearts burning with hunger for meaning that the Emperor's silence had never provided. The chaplains resisted with all their might. They thundered from the pulpits that the voices were lies, that only the Emperor's silence was holy, that temptation was the true test of loyalty. They declared that to listen was to fall, to kneel was to be damned forever. But even as they roared, their sermons rang hollow. They had once been the heart of the chapter's faith, their voices unshakable, their words heavier than bolter shells. Now they trembled with fear, their confidence chipped away by the very silence they preached as sacred. When they ordered brothers to scourge themselves in penance, the warriors obeyed with clenched jaws, not with conviction. When they demanded purges of relic vaults and burning of heretical scrolls, serfs carried out the flames in silence, their eyes avoiding the librarian's gaze. The reclusium, once the beating heart of the chapter's spirit, became an echoing chamber where loyalty decayed with every hollow litany. In the apothecarian, the whispers were even more insidious. The apothecaries, already shaken by gene seed anomalies, began to hear voices guiding their hands. When they cut open vials of sacred progenoid, they swore they felt the organs pulse with hunger, as if eager to evolve beyond the limits of purity. When they spliced tissue, they heard instructions in their ears, promising resilience, strength, perfection. Some resisted, sealing their labs and doubling their rituals of sanctification. Others yielded, guided by whispers into experiments they would once have considered heresy. They mixed gene seed strains, adjusted hormones, grafted tissue that glistened with unnatural sheen. And when the warriors implanted with these alterations rose stronger, fiercer, more violent than their brothers, the apothecaries told themselves it was not corruption, it was evolution, it was survival. The chapter master walked among his sons like a shadow caught between two worlds. He still knelt before the great golden Aquila in his hall, his prayers silent, his lips unmoving, but his ears rang with whispers that never ceased. At night he dreamed of thrones, not of gold but of blood, of stars swirling into storms, of his warriors standing like gods above the galaxy. He woke with sweat on his brow and fire in his veins, his hands clenched as if grasping a blade even in sleep. In council he spoke less, letting librarian Vayner's voice rise instead, letting the captains debate while he brooded in silence. Yet every decision bent toward darkness. Every campaign became more ruthless, every act of defiance more brazen. He did not command it aloud, but he did not stop it either. He let the voices guide the current, and he drifted along their tide. The first rituals began in secret. A handful of brothers gathered in the depths of the fortress monastery, in vaults where the light of the emperor's statues did not reach. They cut their palms and bled upon the stone, chanting syllables that had haunted their dreams. The air shimmered, heavy with the taste of copper and the sting of smoke. They swore themselves to powers unnamed, to gods whose shadows danced on the walls, though no torches burned. When the ritual ended, they rose from the stone floor, trembling, their veins thrumming with new vitality, their eyes burning with fire. They told their brothers of visions granted, of strength beyond bolter or blade, and so more came, drawn by hunger, drawn by the promise of answers where the Emperor had only given silence. The rituals spread like wildfire. Soon entire squads disappeared into the depths, returning bloodied but triumphant, their armor etched with crude sigils painted in their own lifeblood. They marched with a swagger that unsettled those who still clung to loyalty. Their laughter harsh, their eyes alight with madness. On campaign, these warriors tore through enemies with ferocity that startled even their brothers, ripping apart foes with bare hands, roaring prayers not to the Emperor but to the nameless voices that whispered in the warp. The chaplains tried to denounce them, but their words faltered when confronted by the undeniable results. Victory snatched from the jaws of defeat, enemies torn apart, survival ensured. How could they condemn what had kept their chapter alive? It was during the siege of Calvin's Hollow that the voices proved themselves undeniable. The chapter was outnumbered, encircled by Tau forces whose disciplined firepower hammered the fortress walls. Ammunition ran low, armor cracked, warriors bled. In the midst of despair, Librarian Vaynor stood atop the battlements, his arms raised, his voice carrying words not written in any imperial liturgy. The sky itself screamed, the warp tearing open above the battlefield. A storm of shadows descended, cloaking the warriors, bending the Tau's aim, warping their machines until they sparked and shattered. The Astartes charged through the storm, chainswords screaming, bolters roaring, their enemies falling in heaps. When the battle ended, the Tau lay broken, their corpses burned in pyres that filled the night sky with smoke. The warriors roared in triumph, chanting the words Vaynor had spoken, their voices filling the fortress like thunder. For the first time in centuries, they believed not in silence, but in a power that answered. From that day, the chapter was no longer divided between faith and doubt. The balance had tipped. The majority listened to the voices now, repeating their words, etching their symbols into armor and flesh alike. Those who resisted grew fewer, their voices quieter, drowned beneath the roar of newfound conviction. Some chaplains took their own lives rather than see their brothers kneel to the dark. Others bent, reshaping their sermons until they no longer spoke of loyalty but of liberation, recasting the warp's whispers as the Emperor's true voice, misinterpreted for millennia by terror's blind servants. The fortress monastery transformed. The great Aquila remained, but beneath it burned braziers filled with strange incense, their smoke curling into shapes that flickered with eyes. The reclusium rang with chants in languages no mortal tongue should know. The vaults once sealed to contain heretical relics were thrown open, their contents carried out like treasures. The fortress no longer groaned with cracks, it thrummed with a heartbeat not of stone but of the warp itself. The chapter master watched it all unfold with eyes heavy as lead. He knew the line had been crossed, that they were no longer Astartes in truth, but something else, something darker, something free. And yet when he closed his eyes, he remembered the faces of his brothers, their voices once raised in pure devotion, their oaths once unbroken. He remembered the Emperor's statues gleaming in sunlight, the hymns of serfs, the banners of loyalty. A hollow ache filled him, but when he opened his eyes, the ache was drowned by fire, by whispers, by the undeniable truth. The voices in the dark had answered, and the Emperor had not. Thus the baptism of blood became a baptism of the soul. The chapter no longer needed terror, no longer needed the silence of loyalty. They had the warp, and the warp spoke. In its voices, they found strength. In its whispers, they found purpose. And in its promises, they found damnation dressed as salvation. There comes a point when whispers are no longer just whispers, when the shadows cease to be shadows and instead stand revealed as figures with outstretched hands, beckoning. The chapter had walked this path slowly, each step justified as survival, each compromise recast as necessity, each defiance framed as reluctant rebellion. But survival had given way to hunger, necessity to desire, and rebellion to revelation. Now they stood at the edge of a precipice so vast that to look into it was to feel one's very soul lurch. They had listened to the voices in the dark, they had bathed in the blood of the Emperor's servants, they had desecrated relics once venerated and embraced rituals once feared. There was no more twilight left for them. They had reached the brink of transformation, where only two paths remained, ascension into something greater than or an abyss from which there was no return. The signs of this choice began to manifest in the flesh itself. Brothers, altered by apothecarian experiments, grew taller, broader, their armor straining against mutated frames. Their eyes glowed faintly even in darkness, their teeth sharpened into predatory points, their veins bulging with unnatural vitality. Their laughter grew harsher, their tempers shorter, their thirst for violence insatiable. These changes could no longer be disguised as anomalies or battlefield scars. They were proof that the voices had not merely whispered into ears but had seeped into blood and bone, rewriting the sons of the Primarch into something unholy. Some warriors embraced these changes with pride, etching their new forms with scars and sigils, declaring themselves chosen by gods beyond the Emperor's reach. Others recoiled in horror, begging the chaplains for guidance, only to find the chaplains themselves divided, some weeping as they burned their Crozius Arcanum in despair, others raising the weapon as a banner for the new faith. The librarians claimed these mutations were the first steps of ascension, proof that the warp had accepted them as vessels. Vayner, ever the prophet, declared that their chapter was destined not to be erased but to be exalted, to become more than warriors, to become living conduits of power. He spoke of visions where their fortress monastery rose into the skies, borne aloft on wings of shadow, their brothers transformed into demigods striding across the stars. His sermons, once half hidden, now filled the reclusium openly, his voice thunderous, his words wrapping themselves around every soul. He promised ascension, and the chapter hungered for it. Yet not all shared his fervor. In the quiet of their cells, some warriors wept silently, their tears falling upon worn purity seals they could no longer bear to display. They remembered the days when loyalty was simple, when the Emperor's light was enough, when their gene seed was pure and their prayers uncorrupted. They begged for the silence of faith to return, but silence was gone, replaced by the ceaseless roar of voices demanding surrender. A few tried to flee, stealing thunderhawks in the night, seeking refuge among the stars. None returned. Their ships vanished in the warp, their screams echoing briefly across astropathic relays before fading into nothing. Perhaps they were destroyed, perhaps they were claimed. No one knew, and no one asked. Fear of the abyss silenced the questions. The chapter master, once the pillar of certainty, now bore the weight of indecision heavier than any blade. His dreams were no longer of golden thrones and statues, but of storms filled with eyes, of galaxies aflame, of himself seated upon a throne of bone while stars bent to his will. In waking hours he clenched his fists until blood dripped from his palms, torn between the loyalty he had once sworn and the power now within his grasp. He listened to Vayner's sermons, he watched his brothers transform, he smelled the incense of new rituals wafting through the monastery, and still he prayed before the Aquila in silence. Yet the silence gave no answer, and the voices never ceased. The choice came upon them not in council, but in battle. The Imperium, alerted by whispers of heresy and by the silence of inquisitors who had never returned, dispatched a crusade fleet, warships bristling with lance batteries, strike forces of sisters of battle chanting hymns of fire. Regiments of the Astra Militarum, hardened by decades of war, descended upon the chapter's homeworld like a hammer of wrath. From orbit, their fleet blotted out the stars, their vox broadcasts demanding surrender, their prayers to the Emperor echoing across every frequency. They came not for trial now, but for extermination. The chapter was no longer accused, they were condemned. The fortress monastery braced itself. Banners were torn down, replaced by sigils painted in blood. Incense burned so thick that the halls choked with smoke. Serfs armed themselves with lasgons, chanting oaths not to the Emperor but to survival. The Astartes readied bolters and blades, their armor etched with symbols that shimmered with unholy light. The librarians stood at the battlements, their hands raised, summoning storms from the warp that bent the air itself into shrieking fury. And in the council chamber, the chapter master faced his brothers. He spoke not of loyalty, he spoke not of the Emperor, he spoke of survival, of strength, of the abyss yawning before them. "We are damned already," he said, his voice steady as the storm shook the fortress walls. "We cannot kneel, for kneeling brings only death. We cannot flee, for the Imperium will hunt us across every star. There is only one path left. The abyss opens, and we must step into it not as slaves, but as gods." His words were not met with silence. They were met with roars, with fists hammering breastplates, with chainswords raised in salute. The choice was made. The battle that followed was a storm of apocalypse. The Imperium descended in fury, their ships raining fire, their armies marching with banners raised high. The chapter met them with bolter and blade, with warp-borne storms that split the skies, with warriors whose mutated forms tore through tanks and tore apart sisters of battle in showers of blood. The fortress monastery shook, its marble walls cracking, its statues toppling, its chapels burning. Yet in the chaos, the chapter felt no despair. They felt ecstasy. Every bolt fired, every blade swung, every prayer shouted to the dark was answered with strength, with fury, with the undeniable presence of powers greater than themselves. In the heart of the battle, Librarian Vayner unleashed his full might. His body burned with warp flame, his voice shattered vox relays, his presence bent reality itself. He strode through the battlefield like a god of war, each gesture summoning storms that hurled tanks into the air, each word twisting mortals into shrieking husks. To his brothers, he was proof of ascension, living embodiment of the path they had chosen. To the Imperium, he was blasphemy incarnate, a beacon of corruption that demanded annihilation. The Sisters of Battle hurled themselves at him in waves, their hymns clashing with his laughter, but one by one they fell, their bodies burning in his fire. The chapter master fought as if possessed, his relic blade dripping with blood, his roar shaking the walls. He cut down commissars, slew commanders, split tanks open with his strength, and yet within him the war raged still. Each strike was fueled by rage, by the voices that promised power, but each strike also shattered another fragment of the loyalty he had once sworn. He felt himself slipping, his soul teetering between ascension and abyss. In his heart he knew there was no difference, that the abyss was the price of ascension, that the gods of the warp gave nothing freely. But in the roar of battle, in the ecstasy of slaughter, the difference no longer mattered. The fortress monastery did not fall that day. Against all odds, the chapter held. The crusade fleet, battered by storms of warp and torn by the ferocity of warriors beyond human, retreated in ruin. The planet burned, its cities ash, its skies choked with smoke, but the chapter remained. They stood amid ruins, their armor blackened, their banners drenched in blood, their fortress cracked but unbroken, and in that ruin they laughed. They had faced the Imperium's wrath and survived. They had chosen the abyss, and the abyss had answered. But survival was no longer the point. They were no longer a chapter in truth, no longer sons of the Emperor, no longer bound by gene seed purity or oaths of loyalty. They were something new, something greater, something monstrous. They had stepped into the abyss, and in doing so they had ascended. Their souls burned brighter than ever, but in that brightness there was only corruption, only damnation. And yet, to them, it felt like freedom, ascension, or abyss. Perhaps it had never been a choice at all. Perhaps they were the same thing, two faces of the same coin, two names for the same fate. The chapter no longer cared. They had survived the Emperor's silence, the Inquisition's wrath, the Imperium's judgment. They had chosen their path, and they would walk it until the stars themselves went dark. Every oath broken, every drop of blood spilled, every whisper heeded had led the chapter to this moment. They had cast aside loyalty, drowned in rebellion, and crowned themselves not as servants but as gods in waiting. Yet in the grim darkness of the far future, all power is a bargain, and all bargains bear a price. Damnation is not a choice made once finished and forgotten. It is a road without end, each step demanding more blood, more sacrifice, more of the soul. And the chapter, though triumphant in battle, though swollen with new strength, could not escape the toll. Their ascension was not glory without cost. It was a crucible where every victory burned away another fragment of what they once had been. Those still standing bore the scars of their baptism. Statues of the Emperor toppled, their marble faces shattered into dust. Chapels once filled with incense now reeked of charred flesh and strange smoke that shimmered with unnatural hues. The banners of the Aquila still hung, but beneath them new sigils were painted in blood, writhing when the eye lingered too long. The serfs who had once served with trembling reverence now cowered in terror. Their prayers to the Emperor whispered only in secret. For to be caught in such faith was to vanish into the vaults, never to return. The Astartes themselves had changed most of all. Their armor no longer gleamed with purity seals, but was scarred and inscribed with markings that pulsed faintly, alive with energies not of the Their eyes glowed, their flesh shifted, their laughter echoed with madness. They called themselves free, but their freedom bore chains invisible yet unbreakable. Chains forged in the warp itself. The price of damnation revealed itself first in the minds of the brothers. The voices that had once guided them with promises of strength grew louder, sharper, hungrier. They no longer whispered only in battle but screamed in the stillness of sleep, clawed at their thoughts in prayer, demanded sacrifice at every turn. Some warriors tore at their ears until blood ran down their necks, begging for silence that never came. Others obeyed, offering their own flesh, their own brothers, their own serfs to the gods that laughed unseen. The librarians, once prophets, now walked the edge of madness, their eyes hollow, their bodies trembling as conduits for forces that threatened to tear them apart. Vayner himself, the brightest of them, found his form warping under the strain. His flesh burned with symbols that crawled like insects, his voice fractured into many, each one speaking in tongues not his own. He claimed it was ascension, that he was becoming more than a but in the shadows some whispered he was already lost, his soul consumed by the very powers he had worshipped. The apothecaries, too, paid their price. Their experiments had created warriors stronger, fiercer, more monstrous. But the mutations spiraled beyond control. Some brothers swelled until their armor split, their bodies bursting with tumors that pulsed like hearts of their own. Others shrieked in agony as their limbs twisted into claws, their faces elongating into snarls that could no longer form words. The apothecaries tried to contain it, tried to guide the transformations, but the warp is not a tool to be mastered. It consumes, it reshapes, it mocks those who believe they hold the reins. The vaults of the apothecarian filled with screams, with failures chained in darkness, with brothers reduced to beasts. And still the experiments continued, for to stop was to admit that the price was too high, and none dared admit it aloud. The chapter master bore the heaviest toll of all. His dreams, once filled with visions of thrones and stars, now rotted into nightmares of chains and fire. He saw himself crowned in iron, but bound by shackles of shadow, his every command not his own but whispered by unseen mouths. He walked the halls of his fortress with a silence heavier than stone, his face carved in grief, his eyes burning with rage he could not voice. In council he spoke rarely, letting others bellow their sermons of ascension, but in private he sat before the broken Aquila in his chamber, his fists clenched, his lips trembling with prayers to a god who never answered. He knew the truth, though he would not speak it. They had not escaped chains. They had only traded them. The Imperium did not forget them. More fleets came, more armies marched, each one bearing the fury of terror. The chapter fought them all. Victories drenched in blood, defeats hidden beneath the warp storms. They became a name spoken with dread, cursed in the halls of the Inquisition, invoked in sermons as examples of what happens when loyalty fails. To the Imperium, they were monsters, damned forever. To themselves, they were survivors, chosen, exalted. Yet with every battle, their numbers thinned. Every victory demanded sacrifice. Every act of defiance drew more attention. And though the warp gave them power, it gave nothing freely. Their souls were coin, and the gods demanded payment without end. The final price revealed itself not in battle, but in silence. For even the voices, so loud, so constant, began to shift. Where once they had promised strength, they now demanded obedience. Where once they had offered visions of freedom, they now revealed chains of servitude. The chapter realized, too late, that the abyss had never offered escape. It had only offered new masters, cloaked in whispers and shadows. Their freedom was a lie, their ascension a leash, their damnation the true gift. Some laughed in madness, embracing their fate, kneeling willingly to powers they could no longer deny. Others wept in silence, broken by the weight of betrayal, their last fragments of faith crumbling into dust. A few tried to resist, to tear themselves free of the voices, but the warp does not release what it has claimed. Their screams joined the chorus, lost forever, and yet, for all the price they paid, for all the damnation they embraced, the chapter endured. They endured because endurance was all they had left. They could no longer return to the Emperor's light, no longer reclaim their purity, no longer rebuild what they had shattered. But they could fight, they could kill, they could carve their names into the galaxy not as saints but as monsters, not as sons of the Emperor but as gods of the abyss. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps survival itself, even in damnation, was victory. The fortress monastery stood still, cracked and blackened, its towers crowned not with statues of saints but with grotesques carved in the image of their new faith. The halls no longer echoed with hymns of loyalty but with chants and tongues that dripped like venom. The chapter no longer bore the Aquila proudly, but they still wore its shadow, mocking the Imperium with the remnants of what they had been. They had become traitors, heretics, monsters. But in their eyes, they had also become eternal. The price of damnation is endless. But in paying it, they had become something the Imperium could not erase. Their name would be cursed in sermons, their deeds recorded in blood, their memory hunted until the stars went cold. But they would endure, damned yet unbroken, chained yet triumphant, forgotten by the Emperor but remembered by the abyss. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, perhaps that is the only immortality that exists.